And very happy to be here with you. And as you heard, I'm very willing to answer questions. Uh, my subject tonight is Dickens and his fictions of childhood. Dickens gave a central role in the novel to the figure of the child, often innocent, suffering, orphaned, abandoned, or simply neglected. He got this from romantic poetry, notably from William Blake, and you put that up, please. And William Blake, in the Songs of Innocence, wrote, "Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead. Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright. Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice." So this is the child. "Little lamb, I'll tell thee, he is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He became a little child, I a child, and thou a lamb." And the other poet of the period of time before Dickens was, of course, Wordsworth. And in his Ode, Intimations of Immortality, he wrote about the child. This is a long poem. This is just the relevant section tonight. He wrote as an epigraph, "The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." And in the central section of the poem, he talks about the child. "Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life star, hath had elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar. Not in utter forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home." So the child comes from God. Heaven lies about us in our infancy, but then, we begin to grow up. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light and whence it flows and sees it in his joy. And of course, the child grows up to be a youth, and at length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. So there's something special about childhood. And in these poems, we see what Dickens also saw the child as something special. Now, had Dickens chosen a career as an actor, say, instead of as a novelist, and he almost did, he went to audition on a certain day and had a cold, so he couldn't speak. We wouldn't have had his wonderful novels, and we wouldn't have had those who learned from him, the Brontes, George Eliot, Mark Twain, Lewis Carroll, James Joyce, among others. Without the example of Dickens, who knows what might have happened? Also, Freud owes him a debt. One critic argues that for Dickens, as the deepest, most powerful influence on Freud, the importance of childhood. Dickens, by means of such characters as Oliver Twist, Little Nell, Tiny Tim, of course, Paul Dombey, David Copperfield, Pip, and a host of others, made a difference in the way our culture thinks about children. Pity for his own lost childhood made him particularly receptive to childhood as a subject. Many Dickensian children, of course, die young in their novels. There is a notable failure of mothering and fathering in the Dickens world. Nell's grandfather, little Nell's grandfather, he leaves her alone at night while he goes off to gamble, and he steals from her. And Quilp, perhaps Dickens's most demonic creation, asks Nell if she would like to be his number two if his present wife might die. He frolics in her little bed after he has evicted Nell and the grandfather. His abuse is sadistic and sexual. When Quilp tells her to be a good girl and she'll become the next Mrs. Quilp, she reacts from horror. Quote, "So far from being stimulated by this delightful prospect, the child shrunk from him and trembled. Mr. Quilp, because he was pleased to contemplate the death of the present Mrs. Quilp, laughed. He delighted in kissing her, smacking his lips, exclaiming, 'What a nice kiss that was, just upon the rosy part.' He called her such a chubby, rosy, cozy little Nell, so small, so compact, so beautifully modeled with such little feet and winning ways. It's hard to see if he wanted to have sex with Nell or eat her. He may have been a predecessor of Humbert Humbert in Louisa, for all we know. But the scene is disturbing because the child is beautiful, innocent, and vulnerable and lovable. There are lots of sadists in Dickens who delight in torturing children. Wackford Squeers in Nicholas Nickleby says, I never threshed a boy in a hackney coach before. There's inconvenience in that, but the novelty gives it a sort of relish. Mr. Creakle, the schoolmaster in David Copperfield, said, he had a delight in cutting at the boys, which was like the satisfaction of a craving appetite. So, Dickens is the chief importer of the figure of the romantic child to the novel. And in spite of the fact that there are some wicked children in the Dickens world and relatively few nurturing adults, we are intensely interested in the child and in the abuse of the child, even when it's grotesque and over the top. Some children in Dickens feel an attraction for the abuser. Fagin is fond of, quote, his dears. Oliver sees him as a generous provider, and he is. Little Nell is devoted to her grandfather, even though he misuses her. In Our Mutual Friend, the doll's dressmaker, Jenny Wren, takes care of her drunken father. She pretends he is her child. Oh, my poor bad boy, he don't know me. What shall I do? My own child don't know me. In such characters, we approach a prevalent theme in Dickens. It's called inverted parenthood. Nell's grandfather says, it's true in many respects, I am the child and she is the grown person. As the image of the child evolves in Dickens, it becomes somewhat less childlike, but its terrible vulnerability becomes more obvious. Nevertheless, even more than Wordsworth, Dickens helps us recover the thoughts and the sensations peculiar to childhood. So now let's take a look at a few of his most famous children, beginning with the first and perhaps the most famous. This was, of course, in his second novel after Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist. This notion of the deprived and abused child caught fire in his imagination. Oliver Twist is the first novel in the English language which takes a child as its central character. It was a revolution. No one noticed it at the time. Its theme appealed to Dickens, and it was one into which all the resources of his fertile imagination could be poured. Oliver fighting toward respectability, his journey from dirt to cleanliness and gentility, is really Dickens, working through his own childhood in disguised form. The associations came flooding back to him as he wrote, his separation from his family, and Oliver asking for some more is his own obsessive comparison for the need for food with the need for love. Though this is the first of his novels to take a child as its hero, it is by no means the last. Oliver is the first of a long line of actually or functionally orphaned and isolated child protagonists. It's not a Bildungsroman like Copperfield, in which the hero progresses from childhood to maturity. Oliver's progress is from an unsettled, uncared for, innocent childhood to a settled and secure, but a still innocent childhood. Despite his shocking act of revolt in asking for more, Oliver is less an active agent than a passive sufferer. He suffers the harsh treatment that society, in the form of the new poor law, metes out to its unfortunates. Oliver is the Wordsworthian child of nature, around whom the shades of the prison house of society close. He is also that little lamb, Blakean innocent. Throughout the novel, he is mentally and physically confined, first in the workhouse, and then when he goes off on his apprenticeship to a coffin maker, he sleeps in the coffin in a confined space. But let's begin. Meeting him where you may already have met him, 9-year-old Oliver Twist in the workhouse. Now I'm quoting from the novel. Boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last, they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age and hadn't been used to that kind of thing, you can see him here on the slide. This is the original illustration by Cruikshank, the tall boy. His father had kept a small cook shop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy who slept next to him. He had a wild, hungry eye, and they believed him. Lots were cast. Who should walk up to the master after supper and ask for more? And it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The gruel was served out. The boys whispered to one another. They winked at Oliver. Child as he was desperate with hunger. He rose from the table and advancing, basic basin and spoon in hand, he said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." "What?" said the master in a faint voice. "Please, sir, I want some more." This is one of literature's best known scenes of all time. It's more than just a cry for hunger. What Dickens gives us is black comedy, savage, cannibalistic hilarity. The tall boy, you see him there, threatening to eat the boy next to him. The detail about his father keeping a cook shop. The Latin per diem comes from the poor law regulations. It's all translated into the child's own words and emotions of being scared, and we bond with the child. The whole scene is choreographed before the boy even speaks, and we wait. His famous words combine politeness, "Please, sir," the boy knows his place and his manners, with the firm assertion of not "may I" or "can I," but "I want more." The sentence starts in deference and ends in rebellion. Dickens made sure we paused in the pages of his book by having it illustrated by one of his best and most famous illustrators, George Cruikshank. He brings out the scariness with the cadaverous boys licking their fingers, sucking their spoons, just as Dickens described. The tall boy hovers ghoulishly at the back. And what are those weird shadows behind him? Oliver is desperate, and he and the starving boys, like Dickens's wonderful words, burst out in energy. Well, when Dickens wrote, and here's a modern rendering, there have been so many illustrations of it, of Oliver asking for more. When Dickens wrote this scene in January 1837, he was just short of his 25th birthday. This was the first novel of which he was in total charge. Pickwick, his first, was a commission whose format had been decided by his publishers. And when he was in the middle of writing Pickwick, he started the installments for Oliver Twist. And this month, which saw the birth of little Oliver, also saw the birth of his first child, the first of 10. So no doubt children were on his mind. The novel also contains the artful dodger, a delightful little thief who must be punished, but who sparkles at his trial for pickpocketing when, asked by the court officer if he has anything to say, replies, "No, not here, for this ain't the shop for justice." We also see the children in Fagin's gang, full of delightful energy. But Dickens always sees everything from two opposed points of view. He's never simplistic. Recall one of the most famous opening lines in all of fiction. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This is the hallmark of the Dickens style. Of course, he exaggerated. That's why he was so great. For Dickens, more is always best. From the moment Oliver Twist appeared, everyone was reading it. The young Queen Victoria urged her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, to read it. He resisted. I don't like those things. I wish to avoid them, and therefore I don't wish to have them represented, he said. But he was in the minority. Oliver asking for more became a staple of House of Commons debates. Adaptations appeared everywhere. Translations proliferated. It was translated into Albanian, into Vietnamese. And in our day, the big screen loved it. Oliver Twist was Charlie Chaplin's favorite novel. He wove it into his first full-length comedy, The Kid, 1921. Some see Dickens as the father of the new media of film. The scene of Oliver asking for more became a highlight, a defining event. Today, the musical is often people's introduction to Dickens. Oliver constantly reappears. Between 1984 and 2004 alone, there were 65 new editions of the book. Well, it was followed by 14 and a half more novels, 5 Christmas books, many of them different, most including children. Of course, we remember Tiny Tim. He also left behind more than 14,000 letters, stories, essays, journalism, attesting to what we should by now have grasped. He took pleasure in just putting a pen to paper. Now I'm going to take a look at a few more of the most prominent of his novels, which include children and his vision of childhood. Well, here is little Nell with her grandfather. This is, of course, a modern illustration. This novel was written in weekly parts, and it was an enormous success. It sold over 100,000 copies each week, better than any previous Dickens novel. It anticipated, the way it was put into weekly series, a popular weekly television series. There's a story that American dock workers met the ship carrying the installment from Britain, whereon Nell died, with shouts of, "Is Nell still alive?" The novel was highly successful on both sides of the Atlantic. He was deeply involved with this child character and deeply affected by her death. As a matter of fact, during the time he was writing it, he lost his own beloved sister-in-law, Mary Hogarth, at the age of 17. Today, many people find it difficult to read, even devoted Dickensians. Oscar Wilde is famous for having once remarked, "One must have a heart of stone to read the death of little Nell without laughing out loud." Well, we are a more ironic generation. We suspect sentiment, but Dickens said he loved fairy tales as a child, and he still loved them when he was an adult. And Nell certainly lives in a fairy tale world. This is one of the original illustrations. This shows little Nell dying. He was, as I said, suffering grief at the death of his sister-in-law. But here is Nell in her innocence. She represented endurance, forgiveness, martyrdom. She's a fairy tale girl. Look at all the stuff around her, her dolls, all of the paraphernalia of childhood, her little room. This wonderful detail, which is so typical of Victorian illustration, shows her as a fairy tale child in a very dark world. She's the only bit of light in that world, indeed. Well, his next novel with a child is Dambian's Son, 1848. As the novel begins, Dombey's wife has so far given him only a daughter, Florence, but Dombey wants a son. And almost with her last breath, his wife eventually delivers him a son. And in the novel's opening scene, Dombey fantasizes about the future of his business now that he has a son. Quote, "The earth was made for Dambian's son to trade in, and the sun and the moon were made to give them light. Rivers and seas were formed to float their ships. And here again is another illustration, a modern one, of little Paul watching the clockmaker fix the clock. And it's important because it's a clock, because the clock is ticking and little Paul, of course, is going to die. After his wife's death, Mr. Dombey is absorbed in visions of the youth, education, and destination of his baby son. Paul grows up, and his father sends him to one of those horrible infantine boarding houses to be instructed by one Mrs. Pipchin. She is one of the many terrible adults whose job it is to educate children. Dickens describes her. This is again an original illustration, very Victorian with all of the paraphernalia of the room. Paul is so small that he has to sit on a high chair. The black cat, perhaps indicating the somewhat witch-like aspect of Mrs. Pipchin. And here's a quote from the book. This celebrated Mrs. Pipchin was a marvelous, ill-favored, ill-conditioned old lady of a stooping figure with a mottled face like bad marble, a hook nose, and a hard gray eye that looked as if it might have been hammered out on an anvil without sustaining any injury. She wore clothes of such a deep, dead, somber shade that gas itself couldn't light her up after dark, and her presence was a quencher to any number of candles. She was generally spoken of as a great manager of children, and the secret of her management was to give them everything they didn't like and nothing that they did. All her waters of gladness and milk of human kindness had long ago been pumped out dry. And he describes Paul as childish, with a strange, old-fashioned, thoughtful way of sitting brooding in his miniature armchair when he looked and talked like one of those terrible beings in the fairy tales who at 150 or 200 years of age fantastically represent the children for whom they have been substituted. In this novel, old-fashioned comes to mean approaching death, and Paul becomes weary and tired and eventually dies. Dickens wrote, Paul sat as if he had taken life unfurnished, and the upholsterer were never coming. The child doesn't realize his death is coming, but the reader does. Dickens is able to create that consciousness and depict the feeling of what it was like to be a child. Well, now we're going to get a bit of an autobiographical fragment that Dickens wrote for his friend John Forster. It's not until the middle of his career that Dickens began first-person narratives recalling their writers' childhoods. And at this time, he wrote this fragment of an autobiography, and he showed it to his friend and future biographer, Forster. George Orwell, in his essay on Dickens, said, "No one has written better about childhood than Dickens." When Orwell read Copperfield as a 9-year-old boy, he said, "The mental atmosphere of the opening chapters was so immediately intelligible to me that I vaguely imagined they had been written by a child." Well, now I'm going to give you an excerpted account of Dickens's own fragmentary depiction of his childhood. It's a remarkable piece of writing, and it was never published in his lifetime. It was proposed that I should go to the blacking warehouse at a salary of 6 shillings a week. This offer was accepted very willingly by my father and mother, and I went down to the blacking warehouse to begin my business life. I think he was about 12 years old when this happened. It is wonderful to me how I could have been so easily cast away at such an age. No one had compassion on me, a child of singular abilities, quick, eager, delicate, soon hurt, to suggest that something might have been spared to place me at any common school. But my father and mother were quite satisfied. They could hardly have been more so if I had been 20 years of age, distinguished at a grammar school and going to Cambridge. The blacking warehouse was a crazy, tumble-down old house, abutting on the river, overrun with rats, old gray rats, swarming in the cellar, and the sound of their squeaking and scuffling rising up visibly before me as if I were there again. My work was to cover the pots of paste blacking, first with a piece of oil paper and then with a piece of blue paper, to tie them around with a string until it looked as smart as a pot of ointment from an apothecary's shop. One boy came to show me the trick of using the string and tying the knot. His name was Bob Fagin. I took the liberty of using it long afterwards in Oliver Twist. No words can express the secret agony of my soul. The deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly neglected and hopeless, of the shame I felt, cannot be written. My whole nature was so penetrated with grief and humiliation that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often forget in my dreams that I have a dear wife and children, even that I am a man, and I wander desolately back to that time of life. I never had the courage to go back to the place where my servitude began. I never saw it. I could not endure to go near it. For many years, when I came near to Warren's in the Strand, I crossed over to the opposite side of the street to avoid a certain smell of the cement they put on the blacking corks, which reminded me of what I was once. It was a very long time before I liked to go up Chandos Street. My old way home by the Borough made me cry after my eldest child could speak. By degrees, I have come to write this. Forster added, in what way these strange experiences of his boyhood affected him afterwards, the narrative of his life must show, but they were influences that made themselves felt even on his way to manhood. I think that what came out of this childish misery is the creation of so many children in his novels. Well, the next and most famous was in 1850, David Copperfield. Its first sentence, How to Understand Himself, tells us what the novel is going to be about. Quote, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anyone else, these pages must show. In the 1867 edition of Copperfield, this is an edition written just 3 years before he was to die, Dickens wrote a short preface in which he tried to explain how he felt when he finished the book. He felt as if he were dismissing some portion of himself into the shadowy world, when a crowd of the creatures of his brain are going from him forever. He said, no one can ever believe this narrative in the reading more than I believed it in the writing. And he then took his reader into one more confidence. He wrote, of all my books, I like this one the best. It will easily believe that I am a fond parent to every child of my fancy, and that no one can ever love that family as dearly as I love them. But, like many fond parents, I have in my heart of hearts a favorite child, and his name is David Copperfield. I should mention here that David's predecessors as children, Oliver, Smike, and Nicholas Nickleby, little Nell, and Paul, never grow up. Copperfield is the first novel with a child which traces in considerable psychological detail the development of that child into an adult. David Copperfield survives his childhood and becomes an adult. Later, so does Pip. Well, the first chapters of Copperfield detail an early childhood idyll with David, the treasured male child, and that's brutally ended by his mother's remarriage to Mr. Murdstone, a classic portrait of the sort of Victorian parent Dickens detested, harsh, serious, and authoritarian. David is the hero most closely modeled on himself. And here we have in the original illustration, when his mother marries Mr. Murdstone, she immediately gets pregnant. She has another child. And here is little David coming in through the door and realizing that life is changed. Here's the opening of the chapter I observe. The first objects that assume a distinct presence before me as I look back into the blank of my infancy are my mother, with her pretty hair and youthful shape, and Peggotty, because Peggotty was his nurse, with no shape at all, and eyes so dark that they seemed to darken the whole neighborhood in her face, cheeks and arms so hard and red that I wondered birds didn't peck her in preference to apples. This conveys a genuine feeling for how children think. Adult skin feels strange and coarse, and his idea that such skin might be attractive food for birds wonderfully captures how open the child's mind is to possibilities that an adult would find shocking. Indeed, the narrator in Copperfield, the adult David, believes there are certain faculties peculiar to childhood. Quote, I believe the powers of observation in very young children to be quite wonderful for their closeness and accuracy. Indeed, most grown men, remarkable in this respect, may be said not to have lost the faculty than to have acquired it. Thus, the child sees, hears, smells, touches, but does not yet analyze. In most, as the intellectual faculties mature, the sensory faculties get dulled and the analytical one becomes more prominent. But Dickens, I don't think, ever lost that hallmark of a child's observation. Well, David is soon abused by his stepfather, Mr. Murdstone. He finds some refuge in his books, in his little room upstairs. Quote, from that blessed little room, Roderick Random, Humphrey Clinker, Tom Jones, Don Quixote, and Robinson Crusoe came out, a glorious host, and kept me company. Well, the child reads to save his life. In one famous scene, the boy does poorly at his lessons, and Mr. Murdstone takes him upstairs to punish him. Mr. Murdstone, sir, I cried, don't pray, don't beat me. I've tried to learn, sir, but I can't learn while you and Miss Murdstone are by. Can't you indeed, he said. We'll try that. He had my head as in a vice, but for a moment, entreating him not to beat me, I stopped him. He cut me heavily an instant afterwards, and in the same instant I caught the hand with which he held me in my mouth between my teeth and bit it through. It sets my teeth on edge to think of it. This is a wonderful, see the double vision, the initial thing, and then the reflection. It sets my teeth on edge to think of it. He beat me then as if he would have beaten me to death. Then he was gone, and the door was locked. And I was lying fevered and hot and torn and sore and raging in my puny way upon the floor. How well I recollect, when I became quiet, what unnatural stillness reigned through the house. How well I remember. See, there's that second, the reflective mind. When my smarts and passion began to cool, how wicked I began to feel. My stripes were sore and stiff and made me cry, but they were nothing to the guilt I felt. It lay heavier on my breast than if I had been a most atrocious criminal. I shall never forget the waking next morning, the being cheerful and fresh for the first moment, and then being weighed down by the stale and dismal oppression of remembrance. After he bites Mr. Murdstone, of course, he's sent away to boarding school. And in the next slide, this is again an original slide from the original publication. David is sent away and he stops at a restaurant and he's so innocent, and the waiter fleeces him out of his dinner, telling him he needs to taste things and touch things. And it's again a wonderful, the smallness of the child and the oppressiveness of the waiter who's going to eat most of the food. The first person point of view allowed Dickens to conjure up how it feels to be a child. This was one of his special talents. Once David goes to school, his task is learning how to be a good man. The depiction of his infancy and childhood was the inspiration of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man. Dickens showed how the style of childhood is different from that of adulthood, and it was worthy of a different artistic representation. Surely this is why Freud was so fond of David Copperfield. David feels uncared for. This is how Dickens experienced his own parents. Thus, the novel evokes Dickens's life without actually representing it. David finally finds success both in his writing life and in his domestic life, where Dickens, I have to say, succeeded only partially. Copperfield has become the quintessential Dickens novel, the easiest, the most appealing, the most frequently known for itself rather than through movies. It was a huge success, and it relieved Dickens of all his financial worries. He was becoming first among contemporary novelists. He achieved similar effects in Bleak House with the Miss Barbary chapters, and certainly with Mrs. Joe and Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. He gets at the feelings of the child. Copperfield soon became and remained a general favorite. The great novelist Tolstoy wrote of it, "If you sift the world's prose literature, Dickens will remain. If you sift Dickens, David Copperfield will remain. If you sift David Copperfield, the description of the storm at sea will remain." There was widespread agreement that David Copperfield was his masterpiece. Well, the next that I want to talk about, the last, is Great Expectations in 1861. This was the most extended and complicated example of Dickens' writing in this mode, intertwining the perspective of a child at the time with the adult's retrospection of the original experience. And it comes in the famous opening of Great Expectations, where Pip describes how he came to name himself. Quote, "My father's family name being Pirrip, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip and came to be called Pip." Then he imagines his dead parents' appearances based on the look of their tombstones. Quote, "My first fancies regarding what they, my father and mother, were like, were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair." And you can visit that graveyard today. It's kind of hard to get to. I once took a tour group there. The bus driver nearly killed me because of the narrow roads. But all those lozenge graves are there. And no doubt Dickens took a walk one evening from his house at Gad's Hill, saw the lozenge graves, and came up with this idea. Well, one evening he came to form his most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things. Quote, "At such a time I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard. That Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried. And that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried. And that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes. And that the low leaden line beyond was the river. And that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea. And that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry, was Pip. Well, this is an original illustration from Great Expectations, and it gives us the opening scene. What the opening of Great Expectations presents is what we might name Dickens's Mortality Ode, a decidedly unromantic account of a child who has never trailed clouds of glory, but has been born into a fallen world, tainted by prison and crime. The scene with the convict shows the child terrified. The first thing he meets the convict in the graveyard, the first thing the convict does is turn Pip upside down, emptying his pockets. In that single gesture, Dickens gives us a powerful metaphor for the way in which this encounter turns Pip's whole world upside down. And again, as in earlier, in Oliver Twist, there are threats of eating someone alive. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips, "what fat cheeks you've got. Damn me if I couldn't eat them, and if I hadn't half a mind to it." He then makes his demands for a file and whittles. The threat, "or I'll have your heart and liver out." He continues, if Pip fails, "Your heart and your liver shall be torn out, roasted, and ate." As Pip watches him depart, he looked, quote, "He looked in my young eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people, stretching up cautiously out of their graves to get a twist upon his ankle and pull him in," end quote. Dickens completely catches the childhood fantasy here. He seeks a gibbet with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. The convict was limping on toward it, as if he were a pirate come to life and come down again, and going back to hook himself up again. This fantasy terrifies him again. Quote, "It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too," end quote. This is completely within the mind of a child, that a child would think that the convict was going to hang himself up again and the cattle were going to watch. Well, the glow of early acceptance and love present in Copperfield before it is poisoned by the Murdstones is entirely absent in Great Expectations. When his companionship is solicited by Miss Havisham for some mysterious reason of her own, her world is even stranger than the world of the village. And she also abuses and ridicules Pip. And Pip, though redeemed by the end, cannot get all the way to happiness, as does David Copperfield. Pip never loses his sense of guilt. In many ways, it's a perfect novel, though less characteristic of Dickens's other vast novels. But then in another way, it's also less great than those imperfect novels. By all accounts, Dickens was an extraordinarily affectionate parent when his children were very little, but he grew progressively demanding and distant as his children grew up. He had a powerful need for control. He loved neatness and punctuality and order. This may have come from what he felt to be his rejection by his own parents, especially his mother, at the time of his father's imprisonment and his own exile to the blacking factory. In his autobiographical fragment, he presents himself as an abandoned waif, exposed to all kinds of evil. Quote, "I know that but for the mercy of God, I might easily have been, for any care that was taken of me, a little robber or a vagabond." Thus we see Dickens as the first great importer of the idea of the romantic child into a central place in the novel, drawing upon Wordsworthian concepts. Copperfield was published in 1850, the same year as the publication of Wordsworth's Prelude. But it was also his own complicated and conflicted memory of himself as a child. He always was returning to it in his novels, always inventing and reinventing it and the memory of his childhood self. Well, I'm going to conclude with this very famous drawing. It was a drawing and it became a painting, and it was called Dickens's Dream. And it shows Dickens at his desk. He had, with his uh, penchant for neatness, and everything had to be in its right place. He had certain objects that had to be on the desk. This is actually his desk. You can see it on exhibit today. And so it shows this is a sort of fanciful idea of Dickens falling asleep and dreaming of all the characters that he has created. These are the ghosts of his imagination, and they're hovering around him. And this was done just shortly before his death. Oliver Twist, Ebenezer Scrooge, Paul Dombey, Little Nell, Little Dorrit, Mr. Pickwick, David Copperfield, Pip, Fagin, Nicholas Nickleby, Bob Cratchit, Tiny Tim, Fagin, Uriah Heep, Pecksniff, Micawber, Miss Havisham, Bill Sikes, Nancy, all of them hovering about their creator as his life on earth was coming to an end. He had been a hard-working writer. He had set a whole world of people before our eyes. All his characters, the great Tolstoy called the characters of Dickens his personal friends. Tolstoy kept a portrait of Dickens hanging in his study and declared him to be the greatest novelist of the 19th century. Everyone has his own version of Dickens. The inimitable, that's what he called himself, underlining it at least 10 times. The protector of orphans, the man of good works. He helped found and support the great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. I was so lucky, one of my sons, who is a surgeon, did his part of his residency at the great Ormond Street Hospital, which was begun and was held with donations from Dickens and others to treat children with diseases. So the inimitable, the protector of orphans, the man of good works, the bad husband who deserted his wife, the mother of his 10 children. But for me, he is above all the great hard-working writer who set a whole world before our eyes. On some days, after he had closed up his home in London, separated from his wife and moved to Gad's Hill, he had to come back into London to work in his office. And on some days when he was at work in his office correcting proofs, and after he had been writing for long hours, he often asked a servant to bring him a bucket of cold water, and he would put his head into it as well as his hands. Then, having quieted the fire in his brain, he would dry his head with a towel and go on writing. For it was writing that was both his deepest love and his whole life. Thank you. So I'll be very willing to take questions. We certainly have time.
We have a question from Janet. She wants to know if Dickens was ever asked to speak in support of child protection work.
Well, he did a lot of child protection work, of course. As I mentioned, the Great Ormond Street Hospital was partially his conception, and he funded it. His major philanthropic work, together with a very rich heiress in London, Angela Burdett Coote. She was the richest woman in England at the time. She wasn't married. She inherited an enormous amount of money. And he convinced her to buy a house. It was called, I think it was the Orion House. And they fitted it up for prostitutes who didn't want to be prostitutes any longer, so that they could learn a trade. They could learn sewing, or they could learn to be seamstress or servant. And for many years, he worked on that project with Angela Burdett Coote. Now, that's not exactly childhood, but he gave so many talks when there was always charged admission, and he would give the money usually to widowed friends. Of course, childbirth was very difficult for women in that period, and there was no such thing as Medicare or insurance policies or health care. So very often women were left to bring up large families on their own when their husbands died. And he would take that money and just hand it right over to the widow. So he was really quite a large philanthropist. Um, he wrote against the poor law. The poor law was something that was put in presumably to help the poor. But what happened was people had to go in there and they were separated by sex, and the children were taken away in a separate place. And he was against that. He believed that families should be together, even though, of course, he broke up his own family. Well, we're all inconsistent, I guess. And but he was a tremendous philanthropist. Mrs. Gaskell, who was, he really discovered her. Cranford was a chapter written in his Household Words magazine. And when he read it, the first chapter, he sort of contacted her. He said, "This is a novel. You need to write more and I'll publish it." And he became very friendly with her. She was married to a Manchester clergyman, and she was a very very intense philanthropist herself. I mean, she wasn't rich, but she did a lot of work with the poor. And when Dickens would invite her to their house, she was always scandalized by the fact that he had so much food on the table and so much fruit bowls and so on. But they got along. But they had similar ideas, but different ways of expressing them.
Herb is wondering about your thoughts on Nell's journey in Curiosity Shop.
On her journey, well, The Old Curiosity Shop is a wonderful book, and I may teach it sometime. It's gotten a bad rap because of Oscar Wilde's quip about little Nell's death. But her journey, she really is beset all around by danger. Her grandfather is no protector, and everywhere she goes, there are dangers. And the worst is this Quilp. And he is sexually preoccupied with her, and she's just a child. So it isn't the sentimentalized book that people think of it as because of that Oscar Wilde quip. But her journey is really wonderful. I think it's first of all, it's an early book, and he's full of that early exuberance. He's discovering himself and his talents, and the journey is. They go to a carnival, they meet players, they sort of see the whole world, but she's always menaced. And I don't think it's a sentimentalized book at all. Of course, he killed her. She had to die. I think she had to die because his sister-in-law, Mary Hogarth, died, and he had to confront that.
Judith says, "Thank you for the talk," and she wants to know, what is a good biography of Dickens?
Well, one that is very readable is Claire Tomlin. Claire Tomlin has an excellent biography. Now, I think the greatest biography is a huge book by Peter Ackroyd. Peter Ackroyd's is just, it's over the top. He has chapters in there where he talks to Dickens, and he just knows everything. So those are my two favorites. Naturally, the very first biography was by his great friend, John Forster. It's in 2 volumes, so old-fashioned. And Forster was so eager to protect Dickens's reputation and to hold back on that whole horrible episode of him and his wife. So, but I do think Claire Tomlin, for a good, solid presentation of his life. And then, but Peter Ackroyd's is just a wonderful book. It's huge, but you'll live with Peter Ackroyd and Dickens if you read it.
Farhana would like to know, do you know how long it took for him to complete a novel?
Well, the interesting thing about this is he was always writing. In other words, he never had a complete book. He would start it, and he really invented serial publication. It's incredible that he could do this. Most of them were monthlies. So he would be writing the monthly installment, which was 38 pages and 2 illustrations. But he had to have at least half of the next installment done so that he would be sure to have it. So he never had, he did, beginning with, I forget now which book begins it. It might be Dombey and Son. When he starts Dombey and Son, he starts this practice of taking a sheet of paper, dividing it in half like this, and on the left-hand side of the page, on the right-hand side of the page, putting his plot, outlining it chapter by chapter as far as he could go. And on the left-hand side, he would just let himself go. He'd write Boodle, Coodle, Noodle. He was looking for a name, Chiselwit, Troublewit, until he got Copperfield or Chuzzlewit. So to me, it was like the two parts of your brain. The one side would be the side that he had to control it, and the other side was letting go. Because I think creation is a combination of controlling and letting go. So he did do several novels as weekly publications. I mean, this is miraculous. He wrote Great Expectations in weekly parts. He had a magazine, and the book that was being serialized in that magazine was not doing well. And so the magazine wasn't selling. So Dickens said, well, I got to write something. So he started Great Expectations, and it was weekly installments. That is one of the most perfectly plotted books in the world. And he wrote it in weekly installments. It's amazing. How he did it, I don't know. But I think, they said he would go into his study every morning at 9:00 and he would write till 1. And then he would have lunch and he would do things in the afternoon. He had a lot of social life. He had a lot of friends. He loved to take walks. He would walk 15, 20 miles. And at evening parties, games and whatnot. And the next morning back at 9:00 at the desk. And somebody once said to him, and nobody could go in. No one was allowed to go in there. And someone once said to him, but what if you go in there and you can't think of anything? And his answer was, I sit there just the same. So that kind of discipline that he had to get the story out of him, there's just never been anybody like this. There hasn't. It's unique. It's a unique thing.
Charlene says, your talk was wonderful, and she wants to know if any of his 10 children ever wrote.
Well, the children are a sad story. He had 8 sons and 2 daughters. And all of the sons but one were a terrible disappointment to him. They didn't have what he had. And whether they didn't have it because they didn't have it or because of the way he was a strict father. And he loved to play with them when they were little, but when they started to, grow up, he wanted stuff from them. He wanted them to do well in school and whatnot. And they're all sad failures. They're in debt. 2 of them went to India and died there. They tried to get a place over there. One went to Australia. One son was moderately a success. And the 2 daughters were interesting because one of them was very close to him. And they were both close to him, really. And they were very talented. One wrote a memoir of him. But his children, you'd have to say that as a parent, he was not a success. It's sad. He was able to create all these children and live with them in the pages of his books. But the real children were a problem. Maybe they were not under his control in the way that his fictional children were. We can control our fictional characters better than we can our own children.
Well, I think that fits into Fran's question perfectly, actually, talking about his daughters, because she wondered if you would comment on Dickens' female characters, not just Nell, but Esther Summerson, Lady Dedlock, etc.
Yeah. Well, people say about him that he never could create a really realistic female character. Many of his females are termagants. They're bad mothers. They're people like the woman in Bleak House who lets her children fall downstairs and don't get fed and taken care of because she's taking care of the natives in Boria Bulaga. His mature women are not very flatteringly represented. And of course, amateur psychologists, as many people are, they say it's because he resented his mother. You see, when he was sent to the blacking factory, his father was in the debtor's prison. And there was suddenly a legacy or something, and the father got out of debtor's prison, and he could have been taken out of the blacking factory. And the father wanted to take him out, and the mother wanted him to stay there and still earn money to help. And he never forgave her for it, never. So it's not until after he leaves his wife, after he breaks up his marriage, really, he falls in love with this 18-year-old actress, Ellen Ternan. And after that, he creates several believable female characters, Estella in Great Expectations, Bella Wilfer in Our Mutual Friend. He begins to see more the complexity of the female, the young female, but he's not famous for his female characters. And he didn't manage women very well in his own life, really, to be frank. He married Catherine. He must have loved her at first. But unfortunately, I mean, she kept getting pregnant and miscarrying. She's a poor woman. She gained weight. She became unattractive. She was dull. Of course she was dull. She was pregnant all the time. And then he is in his 50s. He meets this 18-year-old actress and he becomes besotted with her. And it's sad, you know, it's just sad what happened. And he was very cruel to his wife, really. He never saw her after that. He put her up in a very nice house. He paid all her bills and whatnot. But she always loved him. And after he died, she was not permitted to attend the funeral at Westminster Abbey with the children. They didn't want her to come. It was just not to do. And she took all her letters that he had ever written her and gave them to her daughter, Mamie. And she said, I'm giving you these so that you can see he once loved me. It's just a sad story. What can I say?
I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. Herb wants to know, I loved Dombey and Son. Why isn't it more popular?
Well, I don't know. It's a good book. You know, people are impatient with long books nowadays. They want the Hemingway version of shorter things. If you read, you know, there's a column in the Times, and they always have on Sunday, they have a writer saying, what books have you read recently? It goes a long way to find Dickens in there. And yet he is great. There was a very good article in the New York Times book section a month or so ago by Robert Gottlieb. And he said that Dickens is simply the greatest novelist in English. And he said also, amazingly, he was the most popular in his lifetime. I mean, he appealed to everyone. He was like Shakespeare in that way. People who went to see Shakespeare, the groundlings liked him and the aristocrats liked him. And in Dickens, the people who could buy the penny parts at the railway station liked him, and the people who could afford the 3-volume set liked him. It's a miracle. We don't have that today. I don't know of a novelist who could say he is popular with the great masses of people and also with the literary establishment. It's one of the things that always interests me about Georgette Heyer, and people know I've taught some of her books. She is a very popular romance novelist, and yet she's always been looked down upon, maybe because she's so popular. But she's a good writer. She's not Dickens, of course. Nobody is Dickens. But we don't tend to associate popularity with all classes of people and literary excellence in the canon. So why don't people like Dombey and Son? They should, Herb.
Last one from Anne Marie. She wants to know, does Dickens depict many scenes from children playing games like board games?
Not too many. And yet he played all the time with his children. He put on puppet shows, and they did amateur theatricals, and they had all these games where you whisper something in somebody's ear and the next one gets it, and the next one it comes around to see if it comes to the same. You could do a paper on games in his life. There aren't so many, because the children in his novels, as I've tried to show tonight, they're mostly very sad and vulnerable. I depicted, I gave you 4 or 5, but that's the way it was, because childhood was, children were vulnerable and often ignored. There aren't a lot of, I can't think of any that are really, of course, Pip plays with Estella. When he goes up, and Miss Havisham wants to watch them play. And there are scenes, but he's, of course, poor Pip. I mean, he's attracted to Estella. He wants to show himself well to Miss Havisham. He's hardly enjoying the games, but they do play games, Pip and Estella. But it's definitely not a childish fun game.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Heineman. And